The number that starts appearing right before your money struggles end. You checked your account again this morning. You already knew the number before you looked. Then, on the receipt in your hand, you saw it. 888. 888. Part of you wanted to laugh it off. Money is tight, and reading meaning into a receipt felt almost embarrassing. But this was not the first time this week. The clock, a price tag, a tracking number you never asked to see. Here is the first answer stated plainly. 888 tends to appear during the exact window when financial pressure is closest to shifting, not after it eases, and not while things are still getting worse. It shows up right at the turn, while you are still standing inside the tight month, before your circumstances have caught up to the change already forming underneath them. That much is true. But it is only the surface layer. There is a reason this number appears now instead of during the worst of the struggle, and a reason it keeps returning until you notice what it is actually asking you to release. The moment money fear becomes a pattern you can see. You have started doing the math before you fall asleep. Rent, the card balance, what is left after both. It runs on a loop, quiet and constant, even on nights when nothing new has happened. This is not the same as being bad with money. You know your numbers. You track every transfer. The fear is not about information you are missing. It is about a feeling that refuses to leave, even when the numbers technically add up. Most people assume that feeling will disappear once the situation improves, once the raise comes, once the debt is smaller. But you may have noticed something uncomfortable. The fear does not always wait for the facts to justify it. It shows up on stable months too. It tightens your chest at the grocery store even when your card clears without a problem. That gap between what your bank account says and what your body still believes is the real subject of this video. And this is where most people misread what is happening to them. They think the anxiety is proof that disaster is coming. In reality, it is often proof of something else entirely, a pattern formed long before this particular tight month began. Financial stress activates the same nervous system response as physical danger. Your body does not distinguish between a low balance and an actual threat standing in front of you. It reacts the same way, heart rate rising, thoughts narrowing, focus pulled entirely toward survival. That response was useful once. It kept earlier versions of you safe during real scarcity, a season when there truly was not enough. But your nervous system rarely updates on its own once the danger has passed. It keeps running the old alarm long after the actual threat has changed shape. This is why you can be objectively more stable than you were a year ago and still feel the same tightness in your chest. The circumstances moved. The internal alarm did not get the memo. Recognizing this is not about dismissing your caution as irrational. Caution kept you functional. It made you responsible, resourceful, someone who checks the numbers instead of avoiding them. That instinct has value. But there is a difference between healthy vigilance and an alarm that never turns off. One protects you. The other keeps you locked inside a version of scarcity that your actual life has already started to outgrow. You have likely noticed small signs of that shift already. A conversation that went easier than expected. An unexpected bit of breathing room. A sense, faint but real, that something underneath the numbers is beginning to move. This is the season where a very specific signal tends to appear, arriving with real precision, right at the point where the internal alarm and the external reality begin to separate. Understanding why it appears now and not earlier is where the next layer of this begins. Why 888 chooses this exact season to appear. The number is 888. Not a generic symbol of wealth, the way it gets flattened on most spirituality pages. The deeper meaning is more specific and more useful. In numerology, 8 carries the shape of balance folded in on itself, a figure with no beginning and no end. Tripled, it stops being about luck and starts pointing toward structure. Not money appearing from nowhere. Money returning to correct alignment. That distinction matters. A windfall is not the same as a correction. A windfall is external and temporary. A correction is internal first, and it tends to hold. Here is the detail most people miss when this number starts appearing. 888 rarely shows up during the worst stretch of financial struggle. It shows up slightly after the internal shift has already begun, even if the bank account has not caught up yet. That timing is not a coincidence. It is a marker. Something in how you are relating to money has already started to change, quietly, before you consciously registered it. The number is confirming a shift already underway, not promising one that has not started. This is where the video earns its title. The struggle is not ending because 888 appeared. 888 appeared because the struggle had already started ending, underneath the surface, before the numbers had permission to move. Think about what changed recently, even something small. A boundary you finally held with a family member who always borrows and never repays. A subscription you canceled without guilt. A job offer you actually considered instead of dismissing out of fear. Each of those is a structural shift, not a lucky break. And structural shifts are exactly what 888 tends to mark, because the number is tied to systems finding their proper order, not chaos finding a lucky break. There is a common trap here, and it deserves direct naming. Some people, once they notice 888, begin treating it as a magic guarantee. They stop taking practical action, waiting for money to simply arrive because the sign appeared. That approach misunderstands what the sign is for. It is not a replacement for action. It is confirmation that your actions and beliefs are finally aligned enough for effort to actually land somewhere, instead of disappearing into an old pattern that absorbed everything you tried. This is the piece almost nobody explains clearly. The number is not doing the work. It is marking the moment where your internal work has finally created enough room for external results to follow it, which raises the real question underneath all of this. If the shift already started before you consciously noticed it, what exactly shifted? That is the layer the rest of this video is going to open. The old money story. You have been living inside. Every person carries a first money memory whether they can name it or not. A parent's face at a kitchen table doing math that never worked out. A sentence overheard that was never meant for you. A moment where you understood young and clearly that money was fragile. That memory does not stay in the past the way most people assume. It becomes a template, a quiet rulebook your adult decisions keep referring back to, even decades after the original scene ended. You might not remember the exact moment. Most people do not. But you can usually find its fingerprints in how you behave now, whenever money enters the room. Do you apologize before naming your price? Do you flinch slightly when a friend suggests splitting something evenly? Do you feel a strange guilt when money arrives easily, instead of through visible struggle? These are not personality quirks. They are inherited rules, still running. Here is where this gets uncomfortable and useful. Many people unconsciously believe money must be earned through suffering to be legitimate. If it comes easily, some part of them distrusts it, waits for it to be taken back, sabotages it quietly to restore the familiar tension. This belief rarely announces itself directly. It hides inside smaller decisions. Undercharging for your work, avoiding conversations about raises, giving away time you cannot actually afford to give, because saying no still feels like betrayal of some old, unspoken rule. And this is where the pattern reveals its full shape. The old story was not really about money at all. It was about safety, belonging, and whether you were allowed to have more than the people who raised you. That is a heavier question than a bank balance. It touches loyalty. If someone you loved struggled financially their entire life, ease can feel like abandonment, as if thriving means leaving them behind in the very struggle that shaped your bond. Nobody chooses that belief consciously. It forms quietly, usually before you had the language to question it, absorbed the way children absorb almost everything, through observation rather than instruction. The good news is that a belief formed without your consent can also be examined without guilt. You did not choose the original story. You are allowed to choose whether it still fits the person you have become. This is not about blaming where you came from. It is about noticing that the tightness you feel around money may be older than your current bank account, older than this particular hard month, rooted in a story that was never actually about arithmetic. Once you can see the story clearly, something shifts, not instantly and not dramatically, but the grip loosens slightly, And that loosening is exactly the kind of internal movement 888 tends to arrive alongside. What scarcity actually trains your brain to do. Researchers who study scarcity have found something specific. It does not just make people worried. It narrows attention, the same way physical tunnel vision narrows what a person can see under threat. This is called scarcity mindset in psychology, and it is not a character flaw. It is a measurable cognitive effect. When resources feel limited, the brain redirects nearly all its processing power toward the shortage itself. That sounds useful at first. Focus on the problem, solve the problem. But the research shows the opposite tends to happen. Tunnel vision actually makes people worse at long-term planning, more reactive, more likely to make decisions that solve today at the cost of next month. You may recognize this without needing the study. The urge to buy something small just to feel a moment of control. The way a tight month makes bigger financial decisions feel impossible to even consider. So they get avoided entirely. Here's the part that changes how you might see your own recent decisions. None of that was weakness. It was your brain doing exactly what scarcity trains brains to do, protecting against an immediate threat at the expense of the wider view. And this is where most people get the meaning of their own struggle wrong. They interpret scarcity thinking as proof they are bad at managing money. In reality, it is proof their nervous system has been running in survival mode for longer than it should have. Survival mode is not built for strategy. It is built for speed. Grab what is available now, worry about tomorrow later, because tomorrow assumes you are already safe enough to plan for it. The exit from this state rarely comes from willpower alone. Telling a nervous system stuck in scarcity mode to simply think bigger picture is like telling someone mid-panic attack to just relax. Understandable advice, structurally difficult to follow. What actually creates the exit is repeated evidence of safety, small proof that the immediate threat has genuinely passed. A stable week, an unexpected buffer, a boundary held without the disaster you feared. Each piece of evidence slowly widens the tunnel back out. This is not instant, but it compounds, the same way scarcity itself compounded, quietly and gradually, until the narrowed view became your default. This is precisely the season where certain signals tend to arrive. They mark the exact stretch where the nervous system has gathered just enough evidence to start loosening its grip, even before your bank statement fully reflects it. Recognizing this widening is part of the work. The next layer is understanding what that grip has actually been costing you while it held on. The silent cost of proving you deserve more. There is a quiet belief many people carry without ever saying it out loud. The idea that ease has to be earned through visible struggle first or it does not count. You can see this belief in how people talk about their wins. Someone rarely says that opportunity simply found me. They say, I worked myself to exhaustion, and finally it paid off, as if the exhaustion itself was the required entry fee. This belief has a cost, and it is rarely discussed directly. It teaches you to distrust anything that arrives without matching struggle, which means paradoxically, it can make you resist the exact ease you have been hoping for. Think about the last time something good happened financially with unusual ease. A client who paid faster than expected. A bill that turned out smaller than feared. Did you fully receive that moment? Or did some part of you brace for the correction, waiting for the good news to reveal itself as a mistake? That bracing is the cost. It means even genuine relief gets filtered through suspicion before it can land. The nervous system treats unearned ease as unstable, something to be corrected rather than trusted. And this is the detail most people never examine. If you unconsciously believe good things must be paid for with suffering, then arriving ease actually creates internal tension instead of relief. You have been trained to distrust the very thing you say you want. This shows up in smaller, sneakier ways too. Turning down help because accepting it feels like admitting weakness. Overworking on a project that is already finished because stopping feels undeserved without one more layer of proof. None of this is really about laziness or its opposite. It is about a deep, often invisible rule that says worth must be demonstrated constantly, that rest and ease are privileges reserved for people who have suffered enough to unlock them. Here is where the pattern starts to loosen. Worth is not actually something you earn through struggle. It is something that already exists, whether or not the struggle is present. Struggle can produce results. It does not produce worth. Separating those two ideas, results and worth, tends to be one of the quieter turning points behind financial shifts. From the outside, they look sudden. Internally, they were building for a long time before anyone else could see them. This is often the exact terrain where 888 starts appearing more frequently, not as reward for suffering completed, but as recognition that the suffering was never actually the requirement in the first place. What replaces that old requirement is what comes next. Why the numbers show up before the bank account changes. There is a question worth asking directly. If 888 marks a shift already underway, why does it show up before the money itself visibly changes? Why the gap? Carl Jung called this synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that is not causal but still carries significance because it lines up with an internal state at the exact moment that state is shifting. The number does not cause the change. It reflects it. Think of it less like a fortune and more like a mirror catching light at a specific angle. The light was always there. The mirror only becomes visible when the angle is right, when your internal position has moved enough to catch it. External results, money included, tend to lag behind internal shifts. A bank balance changes only after actions change. Actions change only after beliefs loosen. Beliefs loosen only after enough evidence of safety accumulates, as covered earlier. So by the time your circumstances visibly reflect the shift, the internal work is often already finished. The number tends to appear during that lag, the space between the internal reordering and its external proof, precisely because that gap is where recognition matters most. This is where most people misunderstand the timing. They assume the sign should appear once things get easier, as a kind of reward. In practice, it often appears earlier, while things are still hard, because that is exactly when reassurance is most needed and most useful. Consider it from a psychological angle instead of a mystical one for a moment. Attention shapes what you notice. Once your nervous system starts loosening its scarcity grip, you begin noticing evidence of stability you would have filtered out before, including small resonant details like a repeating number. Both explanations, the symbolic and the psychological, point toward the same practical truth. The number is a marker of readiness, not magic delivery. It tells you that something in you has become receptive enough to notice a shift beginning, before the shift has finished proving itself externally. This distinction matters because of what you do next. Treating the number as a lottery ticket leads to passive waiting. Treating it as a readiness marker leads to a different question entirely, one worth sitting with directly. If you are ready enough to notice the shift beginning, what would it look like to act as though the shift is already real, instead of waiting for the bank account to confirm it first? That question is where the difference between hoping for change and actually aligning with it becomes visible, and it is the exact territory this opens into next. The difference between hoping and aligning. Hoping feels active, but it often is not. It is watching the door and waiting for something outside yourself to walk through it. Checking, refreshing, wondering if this is finally the week things turn. Aligning is quieter and less dramatic. It looks like small, consistent decisions made from the assumption that the shift is already underway, rather than decisions made from fear that it might never come. The difference is subtle in language and enormous in practice. Hoping says, I need this to change so I can finally feel calm. Aligning says, I am choosing calm enough to make clearer decisions, which tends to change things. Neither guarantees an outcome, but one keeps you in a reactive posture, waiting for evidence before you are willing to shift. The other treats the internal shift as the starting point, letting external evidence follow at its own pace. Here is where this becomes concrete instead of abstract. Aligned action might look like finally naming your actual rate instead of the discounted one you offer out of fear. It might look like applying for the role you assumed was out of reach. It rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Nobody applauds someone for sending one honest email about their pricing, but that single decision often marks the exact point where an internal shift becomes an external one, quietly, without ceremony. This is the part most people skip, understandably, because it requires acting before the proof arrives. You are being asked to move as though the shift already happened, while your bank account still reflects the old story. That is uncomfortable. It should be. But it is also precisely the bridge between an internal correction and an external result. Nothing changes on paper until someone takes an action that assumes the new story is already true. There is a useful test here. Ask yourself what you would do differently this week if you already knew, with total certainty, that your financial situation was about to shift for the better. Then do that thing, even without the certainty. Not recklessly. Not by ignoring real constraints, but by choosing the version of the decision that assumes stability is coming, instead of the version that assumes scarcity is permanent. This single shift, choosing the aligned decision over the merely hopeful one, is often the exact hinge point. People later look back and say something changed around here, without being able to name the precise day it started. What tends to surface once you begin making that shift is what comes next, because alignment always asks something of you before it gives something back. What you have been protecting yourself from by staying small. Staying financially small is rarely a passive accident. Somewhere underneath it, there is usually a protective function, something the smallness has been quietly shielding you from having to face. This sounds counterintuitive, since struggle feels like the opposite of protection. But the nervous system does not always distinguish between avoiding pain and avoiding change, and change, even good change, registers as risk. Consider what growing financially would actually require of you. Visibility, for one. Charging more means being seen more clearly, judged more directly, no longer able to hide inside the safety of low stakes. For someone who learned early that being noticed invited criticism, staying small can feel safer than the alternative, even while it produces the exact struggle that person consciously wants to escape. There is also the risk of outgrowing people. If your family or close friends are struggling financially, succeeding can create an unspoken distance, a fear that thriving will read as abandonment or as an accusation of everyone still stuck behind. Nobody chooses this trade consciously. It happens underneath awareness, a quiet negotiation between the part of you that wants more and the part of you that is terrified of what more might cost relationally. And this is where the pattern reveals something most people never say out loud. Sometimes the fear is not failure. Sometimes the fear is succeeding, and having to hold a version of life nobody around you modeled or prepared you for. That fear can be more paralyzing than the fear of running out entirely, because at least running out is familiar. Success, real and sustained, is often unmapped territory for people who grew up around scarcity. Naming this is not about assigning blame to anyone, including yourself. It is about recognizing that some of the resistance you feel toward financial growth may have nothing to do with capability, and everything to do with an old fear of what comes after arriving. Once that fear is named directly, it tends to lose some of its silent authority. Fears operating outside of language keep their full grip. Fears spoken plainly become something you can actually examine and choose around. This is often where people notice a strange lightness arriving alongside financial movement. It is a sense of relief that has nothing to do with the numbers themselves, and everything to do with finally letting the old protection stand down. What that lightness reveals about the people and beliefs you are quietly outgrowing is where this goes next. The people and beliefs you outgrow. On the way to enough. Financial change rarely arrives in isolation. It tends to reshape relationships, sometimes gently, sometimes in ways that surface tension nobody expected to appear. Some friendships were built, quietly, around shared struggle, complaining about money together, comparing tight months like currency of connection. When one person's situation shifts, that shared language can suddenly feel out of reach for the other. This does not mean the friendship was fake. It means part of its foundation was circumstantial, and circumstances are allowed to change without erasing what was real. But the discomfort during that shift is genuine, and worth naming instead of avoiding. You may notice certain people pulling back once your situation improves, even subtly. A joke with an edge to it, a comment about how you have changed. This can feel confusing, especially if you have not changed who you are, only what your bank account reflects. Here is a distinction worth holding on to. Their discomfort is information about their own relationship with scarcity, not necessarily a verdict on you. People often resist watching someone else escape a pattern they still feel trapped inside. This is not a reason to shrink back down to preserve comfort for everyone else, but it does explain why financial growth sometimes comes with an unexpected grief, the quiet loss of dynamics that used to feel stable, even when those dynamics were partly built on mutual struggle. Beliefs shift alongside relationships. You may find old financial rules starting to feel foreign. The idea that money is inherently corrupting. The idea that wanting more is a character flaw. The idea that security is naive to expect. These beliefs were often protective once, shielding you from disappointment in circumstances where more truly was not available. But protection designed for a past season can quietly become a ceiling in a new one if it is never re-examined. And this is exactly where most people misread what is happening to them during this stretch. They interpret the discomfort of outgrowing old beliefs and old dynamics as a sign something is going wrong, rather than a sign something is finally moving. Growth, financial or otherwise, is rarely comfortable while it is happening. It tends to feel like loss before it feels like arrival, because the old identity has to loosen its grip before the new one can settle in fully. This loosening is uncomfortable but temporary. What replaces it once you move through this stretch instead of retreating from it is what opens directly next. Why receiving feels harder than working for it. For many people, working hard feels safer than simply receiving. Effort is something you can control, measure, and justify. Receiving requires trusting something you cannot fully control, which makes it feel far more vulnerable. This shows up in small daily moments. Someone offers to cover a bill, and the instinct is to insist on paying them back immediately, sometimes even before the original favor has settled. Comfort restored, vulnerability closed. There is a psychological reason for this discomfort. Receiving puts you briefly in a position of dependence. For anyone who learned early that dependence was risky, that leaning on someone else could be met with disappointment, receiving can trigger the same alarm as danger. So the nervous system reaches for the fastest exit, which is usually reciprocity. Pay it back quickly. Restore the balance. Return to a position where nothing is owed and nothing feels exposed. This instinct is not wrong exactly, but it can quietly sabotage financial growth. If receiving itself feels unsafe, then opportunities, raises, unexpected income, even generosity from others, get met with suspicion instead of ease. And this is where most people misunderstand their own resistance. They think they want more money. What they often actually resist is the vulnerability of allowing more to arrive without immediately needing to offset it with effort or repayment. Practicing receiving deliberately and without rushing to balance the scale is uncomfortable at first. Letting a compliment simply land instead of deflecting it. Letting help simply help, without an immediate exchange to make it feel earned. Each small practice of this kind builds tolerance, the same way exposure slowly reduces any fear response over time. The nervous system learns gradually that receiving does not automatically lead to loss or obligation. This tolerance matters more than it seems because financial growth almost always requires a period of receiving before the effort catches up to explain it. A client refers you before you have proven yourself twice over. An opportunity appears slightly ahead of your readiness. If receiving still feels unsafe in those moments, the instinct is often to shrink the opportunity down to a size that feels earned, unconsciously limiting what could have grown further. Comfort with receiving widens what you are able to hold. This is often exactly the terrain where 888 becomes most frequent, marking not just a financial shift, but a widening capacity to receive it without flinching or immediately trying to give it back. What that widened capacity eventually reveals once enough evidence accumulates is the actual turning point named directly next. The shift that happens before you notice the numbers change. There is usually a specific quiet moment where the internal shift completes itself, well before the bank account provides any visible proof. Most people cannot name the exact day, but looking back, they can usually name the season. It often does not feel dramatic while it is happening. No lightning bolt of clarity. More often, it feels like a slightly steadier breath during a conversation about money that used to leave you shaking. A boundary held without the usual guilt spiral afterward. These moments are easy to dismiss as small. They are not small. They are the actual turning point, the place where the old alarm system finally registers that the threat level has changed, even if external circumstances have not fully caught up yet. Here is what tends to happen next in a sequence that is almost always the same. First, the internal tension eases slightly. Then, decisions made from that eased state start landing differently, because fear was no longer narrowing every choice down to the safest possible option. Those decisions accumulate. A slightly bolder ask. A slightly longer pause before saying yes to something draining. A slightly clearer no to an old obligation that never should have been yours to carry in the first place. None of these, alone, look like a financial turning point. Together, over weeks, they reroute the trajectory entirely. The way a small change in direction compounds into a completely different destination over enough distance. This is where 888 tends to intensify, not as a single dramatic sign, but as a repeated pattern, arriving with enough frequency that ignoring it becomes harder than acknowledging it. The repetition itself is part of the message. And this is the piece almost nobody explains clearly. The number is not marking the moment your finances change. It is marking the moment your relationship to money changed enough that the finances were finally free to follow. If you are currently in the stretch where the bank account has not caught up yet, this is the exact information worth holding on to. The lag is not a sign the shift failed. It is the normal, expected delay between internal correction and external proof. Patience here is not passive. It is active trust in a sequence that has already begun, even though its final result has not arrived on paper yet. That trust, uncomfortable as it is precisely the terrain this moves into next. What remains, once the shift has fully taken hold, is simply the experience of watching the proof finally arrive. Trusting the turn before you can prove it. Trust is easy when the evidence has already arrived. It is much harder, and far more meaningful, when it is asked of you before the proof exists, while the numbers still look exactly like the old story. This is the exact position most people are in when 888 starts appearing with real frequency. Not comfortable, not resolved, still in the middle of the tight month, still doing the math before sleep, but noticing the signal anyway. The temptation here is to treat trust as something you either have or do not have, a fixed trait rather than a practice. In reality, trust in this context is closer to a muscle, built through small repeated choices rather than one large leap. Each time you choose the aligned decision instead of the fear-driven one, even without proof, you are practicing this trust. Each time you let a moment of ease simply land instead of bracing for its collapse, the muscle strengthens slightly. This does not mean ignoring practical reality. Trust here is not blind optimism that avoids budgeting or responsible decisions. It is choosing to make those decisions from a place of steadying belief rather than constant emergency, which changes the quality of the decisions themselves. There is a specific danger worth naming directly, and this is where most people get the meaning wrong. Some interpret the appearance of 888 as permission to stop taking practical steps, waiting passively for money to simply appear. That interpretation misunderstands the entire mechanism explained throughout this video. The sign confirms internal alignment. It does not replace effort. Aligned action, taken from trust rather than fear, is still required to bridge the internal shift into external result. What changes is not whether you act, but how the action feels while you are doing it. Fear-driven effort is exhausting, defensive, focused on avoiding disaster. Trust-driven effort is steadier, more sustainable, focused on building something rather than escaping something. This steadiness is often the final ingredient before external results catch up visibly, not because trust magically attracts money, but because steady, aligned effort tends to produce clearer decisions, better opportunities noticed, and fewer choices made purely from panic. If you are currently holding this trust without full proof yet, that discomfort is not a sign you are doing it wrong. It is simply the space between the internal correction and its external confirmation, the exact space this entire video has been mapping. What waits on the other side of that space once the proof finally arrives is where this closes. What enough actually feels like when it arrives. Most people imagine that enough will feel like celebration, A dramatic exhale after a long fight finally won. In practice, it usually feels quieter than that and far steadier. It feels like checking your account without the familiar bracing beforehand. It feels like a bill arriving and simply being paid, without the old ritual of math and dread that used to precede it by hours. It feels like saying a number out loud, your rate, your ask, your worth, without the apology that used to soften it automatically. Not because you became someone different, but because the old story finally stopped narrating every transaction. This is worth naming clearly, because it rarely matches the imagined version. There is no single moment where a horn sounds and struggle officially ends. There is a gradual quieting, one that can be easy to miss if you are still waiting for something louder. 888, by this point, tends to appear less urgently. Not because the pattern stops, but because the nervous system that once needed the reassurance has settled enough that the sign becomes a quiet confirmation rather than an urgent message. This is the natural arc of every genuine shift. What once required constant reminders eventually requires fewer, because the internal state the reminders were supporting has finally become stable on its own terms. If you are still in the tight stretch, still doing the late-night math, still catching the number on receipts and clocks, this arc is worth holding on to. The frequency of the sign is not permanent. It corresponds to how much reassurance the moment currently requires. What got you here was never really about becoming a different kind of person who deserves money more than you did before. It was about recognizing an old alarm system, understanding what it was protecting, and slowly proving to it, through repeated evidence, that the threat had changed shape. Money struggles rarely end the way movies suggest, all at once, with clear before and after. They end the way most real change happens, quietly, through 100 small corrections that eventually add up to a life that no longer runs on the old alarm. If 888 has been following you through this season, take it as exactly what it has been the entire time. Not a promise, not magic. A marker showing up at the precise moment your internal story finally started catching up to the life you are actually capable of holding. That correction, once it settles, tends to stay settled. Not because struggle never returns in any form, but because you now know from direct experience exactly how to recognize the turn the next time it begins.